Hello, welcome back to Trapped by the Ice by Mccurdy. We are going to read pages 216 until the end of our story, and so this is the read aloud time. Mccurdy, and this is page 216. Put my book here so I can read it. Meet the author and illustrator, Mccurdy. Fact file. Mccurdy has illustrated nearly 200 books, including classic stories such as The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. He has also written many books himself. In art school, Mccurdy was a roommate of David McPhail, another children's author and illustrator. To create an illustration, Mccurdy usually carves a picture on a wood block, covers the carving with ink, and stamps it on paper. But it's never too late to try something new. This story is the first book Mccurdy has ever illustrated with paintings. Mccurdy lives with his family in Massachusetts, where he works on his books in a big red barn. He enjoys playing the piano and hiking. All right, so now we're going to start our story, Trapped by the Ice, by Mccurdy. This is a true story. Strategy focus. Can Shackleton and his crew escape from the ice? Monitor your reading to make sure you understand what happens. Reread to clarify. I hope you're following along. Now we're on page 218. October 27th, 1915. The Endurance was trapped. Giant blocks of ice were slowly crushing her sides. From the deck, Sir Ernest Shackleton looked at the snow and ice that spread to the horizon. 10 months before, all he had wanted to do was be the first person to cross the South Pole's ice cap. Now his only concern was for his men. What would happen to them? How much longer did the ship have before it broke apart? The Endurance was leaking badly. Shack could not delay. Shack ordered his crew off the Endurance, and camp was set up on the frozen Weddell Sea. Tools, tents, scrap lumber for firewood, sleeping bags, and what little food rations and clothing the men had left were saved from their ship, along with 3 lifeboats in case they ever reached open water. The Endurance was a sad sight now, a useless hulk lying on its side. For months she had been the crew's home. Now they would have to get used to life on the ice, stranded hundreds of miles from the nearest land. Page 219 shows an illustration. Now we're on page 220, November 21st, 1915. Almost 1 month later, the sound of crushing wood startled the men. It was what they had feared. Turning towards the ship wreckage, they saw her stern rise slowly in the air, tremble, and slip quickly beneath the ice. Oof. Minutes later, the hole had frozen up over the ship. She was gone forever, swallowed by the Weddell Sea. Shack talked with the ship's skipper, Frank Worsley, and his next in command, Frankie Wild. Among them, they would have to decide what to do next. Page 222. December 23rd, 1915. Executing their plan would be difficult. By pulling the lifeboats loaded with supplies, they would try to cross the barren ice to open water. If they made it, they would use their 3 boats to reach the nearest land. Shack studied the unending snow and ice ahead of him. Was it possible? Each boat was mounted on a sledge. Harnessed like horses, the men pulled, 1 boat at a time. Pulling 2,000-pound loads was hard work. Soon everybody was so tired that no one could pull anymore. The crew would have to wait for the ice, moved by the sea's current, to carry them north to open water. This is page 223, and if you need to stop here to answer those questions, please stop. Otherwise, we are going to continue. Page 224. Over the next few months, food was always a concern. And it was Tom Orderly's job to find it. Penguins and seals were growing scarce. To find meat to eat, hunters had to go farther away. This was dangerous. Once, when Tom was skiing back to camp, a monstrous head burst from the ice. A giant sea leopard lunged at Tom, only to slip quickly back into the dark water, stalking Tom from below as the sea leopards do when they hunt penguins. Tom tripped and fell. The huge animal lunged again, and this time springing out of the water and right onto the ice. Whew. Back on his feet, Tom tried to get away. He cried for help, and Frankie Wild rushed over from the camp carrying a rifle. The sea leopard now charged Frankie, who dropped calmly to one knee, took careful aim, and fired 3 shots. The sea leopard fell dead. Well, there was plenty of meat to eat for days afterward. Can you imagine? You're walking on the ice and an animal is stalking you, trying to eat you? Woo! That picture on page 225 is enough to give you nightmares. You know what I mean? Okay, page 226. April 8th, 1916. The men smelled terrible. During their 5.5 months on the ice, think about that, 5.5 months, almost half a year, they hadn't had a bath. So clothes were greasy and worn thin, and they rubbed against the men's skin, causing painful sores. Hands were cracked from the cold and wind, and hunger sapped everyone's strength. By now, the ice floes were breaking up into smaller and smaller pieces all around the men as they drifted closer to the edge of the polar sea. Shack thought it was a good time to launch the lifeboats, rigged with small canvas sails. He knew his men could not survive the grueling 800-mile open boat journey to the whaling station on South Georgia Island, so he decided to try to reach Elephant Island first. Sorry, my dog is noticing the mail carrier outside. Shipley, no. Shipley, no. Okay, now it's time for page 228, 11 p.m., April 8th, 1916. Steering around the blocks of ice was hard. The boats bumped into ice floes, or crashed into icebergs. As night fell, the boats were pulled up onto a big ice floe and the tents were raised, but sleeping was difficult. With damp bags and blankets, and with noisy killer whales circling around. So you're sleeping on kind of like wet beds and blankets. You're sleeping on the ice, on an ice floe in a tent, and the killer whales are circling. Sorry, my dog again. So one night Shack suddenly felt something was wrong. He shook Frankie, and they crawled out of their tent for a look. A huge wave smacked headlong into the floe with a great thud, and the floe began to split into 2 pieces. The crack was headed straight towards tent number 4. Then Shack heard a splash. Looking into the crevice, he saw a wriggling shape below in the dark water. It was a sleeping bag with Ernie Holness inside. Shack acted quickly. Reaching down, he pulled the soggy bag out of the water with one mighty jerk. And just in time, too. Within seconds, the 2 great blocks of ice crashed back together. That was a close one, guys. Ooh, look at that illustration on page 229. That shows just how close it was. Page 230. So now 5 days later, April 13th, 1916. Finally, the men reached open water. The savage sea slammed furiously into the 3 little boats, called the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. Tall waves lifted them up and down like a roller coaster. Blinding sea spray blew into the men's faces. Most of them became seasick. Worst of all, they were very thirsty because seawater had spoiled the fresh water. The men's tongues had swelled so much from dehydration that they could hardly swallow. Shack had his men suck on frozen seal meat to quench their thirst. And they had to make land. They had to get to Elephant Island. April 15th, 1916. After an exhausting week battling the sea, the men nearly lost all hope. Big Tom Crean tried to cheer the men up with a song, but nothing worked. Finally, something appeared in the distance. Shaq called across to Frank Worsley in the Dudley Docker. "There she is, Skipper!" It was land. It was Elephant Island at last. It looked terribly barren, with jagged 3,500-foot peaks rising right up off the sea. Yet it was the only choice the men had. Oh boy. April 24th, 1916. Elephant Island was nothing but rock, ice, snow, and wind. Tents were pitched but quickly blew away. Without resting, Shaq planned his departure for South Georgia Island. There he would try to get help. 22 men would stay behind while Shaq and the crew braved the 800-mile journey in the worst winter seas on Earth. The 5 ablest men were picked: Frank Worsley, Big Tom Crean, the carpenter, Chippy McNeish, and 2 seamen, Tim McCarthy and John Vincent. With frozen fingers and a few tools, Chippy prepared the caird for the rough journey ahead. Only 9 days after the men had first sighted the deserted island, Shaq and his crew of 5 were on the open water once again. This sure seems bleak, doesn't it? For the men who stayed behind, permanent shelter was now needed, or they would freeze to death. So Frankie Wild and the men turned the 2 remaining boats upside down, side by side. The boats were covered with canvas and a cook stove was put inside. The hut was dark and cramped, lit only by a burning wick, and something happened that the men had not expected. Heat from their bodies and the stove melted the ice under them, as well as piles of frozen bird droppings left for years by the frigate birds and penguins. The smell was terrible. Ooh. Day after day, the men looked towards the sea, wondering if Shaq would make it back to rescue them. How long would they be left there? Was Shaq all right? I'm going to stop here on page 234 and continue on a part 2 for this story. Thank you for listening.